Well, good morning. My name's David Beat. I'm director of the Wilson Center's new Polar Initiative. Last year, several of us at the Wilson Center realized there were many programs we're working on here on Arctic issues and Antarctic issues, and we formed an informal Polar Initiative. In May of last year, we hosted an event, Arctic 2014, Who Gets a Voice and Why It Matters, to look at various perspectives of the Arctic, from the United States, Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, and Asia. Each of those speakers at the event contributed to a short video series, Who Owns the Arctic? And we do have policy briefs from that a written sample over there, but they are available on our website. I didn't know how many people were going to come, and you can pick and choose which ones you want. But as of June 1st of this year, with increased attention specifically to Arctic issues as the United States begins its chairmanship of the Arctic Council, the Wilson Center relaunched the Polar Initiative in a more formal manner with a director, and that's me. So the Polar Initiative will foster research and discussion on Arctic and Antarctic issues, looking at the human and economic challenges of the polar regions, as well as the geopolitical issues that affect cooperation. While the initiative will host its own programs and research, it will also serve as an umbrella for similar research activity at the center. So today I'm pleased to host our first program under our new status, Can Russian-Western Cooperation in the Arctic Survive the Current Conflict? I'm pleased to welcome an old friend from Toronto, Irvin Studin, now editor-in-chief of Global Brief magazine and president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions. He is the co-founder of Ukraine's Higher School of Public Administration in Kyiv and a professor of public policy in Russia's Academy of National Economy and Public Administration in Moscow. Irvin has long thought about the challenging relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and I've asked him to turn his attention to how this crisis, if I can call it that, affects the ongoing cooperation that happens in many areas of the Arctic. I'm also pleased to welcome Ambassador Ken Yalowitz, who has served as an advisor to the Polar Initiative and who has been a Wilson Global Fellow affiliated with the Kennan Institute and the Polar Initiative. Ken has taken up a new position at Georgetown as director of the Conflict Resolution MA program at Georgetown. You can read their full bios in the handout. I'd like to give special thanks today to the Kennan Institute, the Canada Institute, the Global Europe Program, and the Environmental Change and Security Program. And I'd also like to recognize the United States Special Representative for the Arctic, Admiral Papp, who was nice to join us today. But now I'll turn the program over to Ken, who will serve as moderator and discussant. Ken will give some introductions. Irvin will speak for about 30 minutes. Ken will respond, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So thank you, and over to you, Ken.
Thank you. David, I just simply wanted to congratulate you on this new Arctic Polar Initiative at the Wilson Center. It's extremely timely, very, very important, and I'm delighted that you're chairing it. We've worked together over several years, and it could not be in better hands, so delighted to say that. Also, a word of welcome. Is David Bolton still here? Oh, he left? Oh, okay. But with Admiral Papp was David Bolton, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for oceans and law of the sea matters, and absolutely terrific representative of the United States. We're going to be talking today about whether Western and Russian cooperation, in the Arctic, what's sort of the health of it, what are the prospects of it. I will save my remarks primarily for afterwards, after Irwin has spoken, but I would simply say that this is a subject that I have followed very, very closely now for several years. Despite all the problems and the risks, of which there are many at this particular point, in my judgment, Western cooperation, with Russia is still proceeding in the Arctic Council and in the Arctic. The problem areas are well known, and we'll talk about them. And in my judgment, this still remains one of the areas where cooperation with Russia may be possible in the future. The overriding interests are so strong, and the problems are so clear: climate change, environmental risks, fishing, oil spills, search and rescue, and all the evidence so far, is that cooperation, on the ground is continuing. The question is, will the externals, the external geopolitical situation, impact to a point where this may no longer be possible. I hope not, I don't think so, but we will talk about that. Let me turn the floor now over to Erwin, and I'm very anxious. The first time we've had a chance to meet, he's a very, very distinguished thinker, writer, analyst, and I'm very anxious to hear what he has to say. So over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, David. And I'm anxious that you're anxious, because anxiety, I think, is the temperament of the day. And I come with considerable anxiety to give anxious messages to what I see as a relaxed crowd. So there's a bit of a paradox at play. But first of all, let me express my sincere gratitude to my friend David Biet on this terrific initiative, the Polar Initiative. It's extremely timely, as we were just discussing with David in the coulisses. The United States is an Arctic country, and there will be an aspect of persuasion involved over the coming years and decades, as it were, to persuade Americans that the Arctic is highly topical. Canada is a little bit ahead. I would say that Russia is way ahead, and this will parlay into my remarks. So congratulations, David. Much success to you. And I'm a big admirer generally of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Honored to be here, and thank you, Ken, for the introduction. I look forward to your remarks. Let me just say that I was last here with David in 2007. When we met, I was a visitor on State Department's International Visitors Program, which I think still exists, correct?
Yeah.
It was a magnificent experience. We spent 3 weeks all over the place. As a Canadian, because Canadians tend to wander the perimeter states and own half of Florida and Arizona, I said, take me to Little Rock. And I spent a wonderful week in Little Rock, and David introduced me to grits. And so that memory sticks with me. And although my wife is here, she's from the former Soviet Union, I asked her to make me grits in the 2007 example. She's yet to succeed. Before that, my first time to Washington, I should say, was as a graduate student in 2001. I worked in Lehman Brothers at the time, a famous bank called Lehman Brothers, as a summer banking associate at Equity Capital Markets. And for the first time in Washington, I mentioned that Lehman Brothers experience at a recent wedding we attended. And they said, that was a really good bank, Lehman Brothers. And it was an interesting time. I remember Dick Fuld holding court at the World Trade Center at Windows on the World in 2001, probably a couple months before September 11th. That was a different world. And let me just say that I was in Moscow for work in December of 2013, and that was a different world as well. Putin was holding a press conference. He does these major 3-hour press conferences with the international press, which I should say are quite impressive. And the temperament was quite different, and how the world changed quite rapidly and unexpectedly in such a short period. And I would dare say that in respect of Arctic conflict and Arctic cooperation, the border between the two can be destroyed even more quickly, and I'll try to touch on some of that in my remarks. Two things before I touch on the Ukraine or the Russo-Western conflict in particular, then parlay it to the Arctic, and then try to tie it back. I released a book last year on Canadian strategy, Canadian thinking in the world, and one of the chapters was on the Arctic. And I ran different scenarios, and one of them was on annexation capabilities. And I ran it by one of Canada's leading Arctic thinkers. I won't mention the name, because his immediate response was, annexation, why would you put that in a chapter on the Arctic? Nobody annexes anymore. And that was in 2013, late 2013. And I mentioned that to him in a conversation about a week ago, that annexation is very topical again, and he took it back. But it still applies in the Arctic, and it's not necessarily a Russian phenomenon that will be apropos in respect of annexation. Second point, I spent considerable time in Asia, particularly in Singapore, professionally over the last several years. And the Singaporean/Asian doctrine in respect of the West at the time was as follows. What is interesting about Asia is that there is no war in Asia today. What is interesting about Europe and North America is that there is not only no war, there is no prospect of war. Again, that was 2013. That is a different reality altogether. There is every prospect of war both in Europe, that perhaps is more evident to Europeans than ever, but I would dare say to North Americans, in a way that has not been top of mind for North Americans, even Pax 2001, since the 1870s, since the Treaty of Washington between Canada and the United States. You know, in all of the 20th century, Pearl Harbor notwithstanding, and then early 21st century, September 11th notwithstanding, North America was the most virginal of continents strategically. We were the lucky continent, if I were to juxtapose what Donald Horne once said of Australia. We were the only continent where there was not major land warfare or a threat thereof. And this will change through a number of dynamics this century in my analysis, and the Arctic is one of them. Just going to grab a drink. There we go. Let me jump to the Ukraine thing. There are 3 conflicts in the world of great strategic import for the global order. I'm speaking here as an analyst, not as a Canadian, not as a Westerner, and not as a friend of Russia and Ukraine, as an analyst. One is the collapse of the Middle East order. The second one is the rise of China and what to do about it, in Asia, in the West, even in China. And the third one is the Russo-Ukrainian Western conflict. Of these 3 conflicts, only one is soluble in the near term, maybe soluble altogether. And that is the third one, the Russo-Ukrainian Western conflict. But the reason I prefaced my remarks with a great degree of anxiety was that it must be solved very quickly if the moment hasn't passed already. For reasons we can talk about later, and we can talk about the causality of the conflict as well. I don't want to go into that, but I dare say perhaps what's obvious in some quarters in North America already, although the news is getting here more slowly, the conflict is very, very poorly understood in the West. It's poorly understood in the English language. Translation is very poor. It's a dialogue des sourds, dialogue des aveugles, dialogue of the deaf, dialogue of the blind. It is, in my assessment, an absurd conflict. There is a solution to the conflict. It has 3 points structurally, and 2 more points related to Ukraine in particular in the global order. And I hope that the United States will move into this, and I'll speak to the State Department later today and convey this message, which I've already conveyed to my Russian, Ukrainian, and European friends through the Institute and through my own work. We do a lot of Track 1.5 work, and some parties get it, but I'm not sure we're on the right page here in North America yet to push the conflict towards a resolution. And a conflict, dare I say, where there are very few angels. There are no angels in this conflict, and there are no morality plays. There are 3 points. One is the introduction of peacekeepers in the Donbass, in southeast Ukraine. Okay? But there's a great proviso to that, and those peacekeepers cannot come from Europe, as is the predilection today of Kiev, and they cannot come from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which was once the predilection of Moscow. They can't come from Belarus, they can't come from Moscow, they need to come from another continent. And in my view, the continent is Asia, because it's the most respected continent after Europe and North America for the Soviet strategic brain. And in particular, it could come from India, whence I came through Track 1.5 work a month ago. India, because India is highly respected in both Kiev and Ukraine, Kiev and Moscow, because the Indians have great peacekeeping experience and they're highly neutral. But it could be other countries or combinations thereof. It must be a neutral country that is respected. But the United States can help move in this direction. But peacekeepers alone won't solve it. The second condition is the removal of the possibility for all time that Ukraine could join NATO. This is an obvious point. Ukrainians themselves understand this perfectly well, rhetoric aside. They've always understood this. Why are we pushing in the other direction? Right? It's an easy win. And the third point is the removal of sanctions not related to Crimea. So 3 points. Asian peacekeepers, by and large, non-NATO, removal of sanctions not related to Crimea. We can talk about Crimea later. That will solve the conflict structurally. And two other points before I get to the connection to the Arctic. The first is that in order for Ukraine to survive that boxing in of the conflict, there needs to be an institutional arrangement that gives it success. And I'm going to be bold in saying that Ukraine cannot survive without the reestablishment of a deep relationship with Russia. It cannot survive or succeed. I think all Ukrainians know this. But it needs to be obviously on terms of mano a mano, égal à égal, equal parties. This can be done through an idea that was floated just as the revolution was taking off in late 2013 by the outgoing Prime Minister of Ukraine, actually. And that was the idea of a trilateral commission between Russia, Ukraine, and the EU. And this can be floated out of the Minsk discussions, which, by the way, are a heroic achievement in my view, building gradually towards a larger institutional architecture for the 21st century, which will tie into the Arctic as well. And here I think Putin is right, that ties Birmingham all the way to Vladivostok. That is Europe 2.0, Europe 3.0, a new Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, that ties Russia into the European architecture and takes care of interstitial problems that are a deep echo from the former Soviet Union. And Ukraine is, a little bit like the Arctic will become, an interstitial problem. Two different regimes colliding, what to do about the stitches in between. Do we tear them apart or do we sew them together gradually? And I think we've been all deeply unintelligent about the interstitial problem of Ukraine. And if I dare say, the most unintelligent, of the us in the treatment of the interstitial problem have been the Ukrainians. The problem starts from Ukrainian incompetence in governance over the course of its 23 years of independence up to the moment of the crash, which everyone saw coming in strategic circles in that country and in Russia, dare I say. The fifth criterion for success related to Ukraine is independent of any other actor, independent of the United States, independent of Russia. It is heroic competence in governance. It's Poroshenko and his team and their successors, some of the young people whom I helped train in the Higher School of Public Administration, need to be heroic. Every country is born through a certain heroism, and in the absence of that heroism, it cannot exist. The same applies to post-revolutionary America. It applies to early Canada with its geopolitical stresses. It applies to Singapore after its expulsion from Malaya, right? But there is no Lee Kuan Yew so far in Ukraine. This is a big problem. And so Poroshenko must be heroic, and he must build a heroic team. And that, unfortunately, is independent of the goodwill or bad will of actors around. We can box the conflict in, but that we can't guarantee success where there is incompetence. That's been a historical problem. So on that conflict, let me just say there's a great time urgency. And for American friends here, if you can convey the message, as I'm trying to do, that this must be solved, in my view, under the Obama presidency. The president seems to have considerable political capital, a lot of strategic time. There's no threat at the border right now. Focus on this problem. It is the only soluble problem of the three I've mentioned, and dare I say, it is logically connected to any prospect of solubility of the Middle East and of dealing with the rise of China in a new Asia. But without Russia, and with futures of Russia that I'll discuss in the Arctic that largely go towards the worse, there is no prospect of solving the Middle East. And the China question will become very complicated. Let me digress and talk about Canada's Arctic game and how it relates to Russia and the United States as well. I divide my time between Toronto and Moscow professionally, before that Toronto and Kiev. I mentioned that Canada is, I would say that North America is the lucky continent. In that continent, Canada is the lucky country. Donald Horne once said of Australia, Australia is a lucky country governed by people who share its luck. He was talking about Canada. because Canada hasn't had a territorial war since y'all were the enemy, right? That was in 1871, and Canadians like to claim that before that, in every bilateral war between Canada and the United States, Canada won, although those were the British, we still won, right? And since then, we brokered the peace, you've become stronger, we become disinterested in strategy. But dare I say that Canada is an extremely well-governed and civilized country, but populated by a lot of strategic naifs. And that can only be so because Canada is one of the few countries in the world where you can declare war on a country, recently Libya, might have been the Persian Gulf War in 1990-91 or any other country, and not expect there to be any réplique. The Prime Minister can effectively, through the royal prerogative, declare war on a country and then go grab Tim Hortons coffee, right? And that certainly begins to form a certain strategic psyche, a softness, that doesn't exist in other areas of Canadian affairs. And I use the metaphor of hockey very seriously. Canadian hockey players are killers. There's a certain seriousness to the ethic. We tend to beat the United States just psychologically. In federal affairs, in national unity on the Quebec question, Canadians are extremely serious because there's an existential question at play. So the quality of the thinkers and the players and the felt seriousness is of the highest order. But in strategy, not so. We tend to think in the abstract. And so I think in some sense we've thought of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict as something happening in the East, not realizing that the borders of this century for Canada are much more complex. Whereas the founders of Canada in the 1860s, 1870s knew that the United States was the natural enemy, brokered the peace, Treaty of Washington, 1871. After that, the borders were fixed, frozen to the north, the east, the Atlantic, the moat, the Pacific. China was having a difficult century, a century of humiliation, as they call it today. And so there was no prospect of anyone at the borders. It was a good, lucky century. But dare I say, through three forces, Canada's luck will change strategically this century. One is, of course, the relative diminution of American prestige and power in the world. This is, I think, an obvious fact. America will remain a major country, probably the number one country strategically over the next half century, but after that, it's anybody's guess. The second is changes in technology that make our borders much more porous. I'm not just talking about cyber, I'm talking about in conventional warfare. And thirdly, the melting of the Arctic, which all of a sudden creates the sense of the other at the Canadian border, which has never existed in modern Canada. We in Toronto, which is a wonderful city, don't tend to think of the other at our border. There's a certain strategic softness. But the Arctic will change that proposition. So Canadian borders are as follows this century. And this is a strategic algorithm I've been putting to my Canadian friends and colleagues in government alike and academia alike. ACRE, A-C-R-E. A is the Americas to the south, draw a vector all the way through to Latin America. C is China and the Asia proposition, which is now increasingly at our doorstep, and Canada is considering itself a quasi-Asian country. R is Russia. Russia is not to the east. Russia is to the immediate north of Canada. And the two big Arctic players this century are not, forgive me for saying, the United States and Russia. They are Canada and Russia, the two giants. And E, which is the European project. And the R and the E I'll come to together. So ACRE. I hope that becomes like the new BRICS or something like that. That just takes off. Because the Russians are very obsessed with the BRICS concept. I say it's a Goldman Sachs concept, but they've taken it and run with it. So Canada's psychology will need to change as a result of the melting of the Arctic. And particularly now, because of the Russian conflict, the cognizance, the consciousness of the other, the Russians at our doorstep. And we can play it a number of ways. I'll try to touch on those. Let me say a couple more things that might come as a surprise to American friends. And that is that by the end of the century, if Canada survives, and it's not obvious that Canada will survive, of course I'm cheering in that direction, but if Quebec should one day go, Canada, in my assessment, wouldn't survive that breakup. So Canada over a century, that's a long time. But if we survive, with all our natural endowments, Canada will become the second most important country in the West. And, dare I say, the second most populous country in the West. Potentially up to 100 million people. Bigger than any country in Europe. Bigger demographically than Russia, which is fast diminishing in demographic weight. That is, if Russia survives. Another question I hope we'll return to. So at 100 million, we'll be bigger than any country in Europe, possibly bigger than Russia. Psychologically, that's very difficult for Canadians to accept. But that will probably be the psychology that we'll need to have in order to negotiate these more complex borders. And it will require us to think of the Arctic proposition not as the proposition in our topic suggested, the West and Russia, but in a much more promiscuous way. A little bit like Singapore, negotiating different borders, a little bit like Ukraine should be in negotiating its borders. That Canada should be playing a Russian game when it goes north, it should be playing an Asian game when it goes west, an America's game when it goes south, and a European game when it goes east. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict has fortunately, unfortunately, pushed us more into a diamond formation where North America or Anglo-North America is much more of a non-porous entity, and the Russians are at the gates, as it were. I think that's a very, very dangerous proposition for both Canada and North America this century for success and survival. So, to the Arctic. Until the Ukrainian Revolution, there was a debate that was actively manifested in Global Brief between two leading thinkers, and I would say they represent two schools of thought on the Arctic. One was the idea that there was a Pax Arctica that was, the logic of which was irresistible, and the future of which was reasonably certain. That every country of the big Arctic 5 and in the Arctic Council, the 8, had an interest in unobstructed cooperation, indeed goodwill. The Pax Arctica thesis was led by Michael Byers in Canada, but had many exponents in other countries, including the United States. The counter thesis to that was articulated very eloquently by Charles Emerson of Chatham House in the UK. I don't know how Charles and Chatham House became interested in the Arctic, but it was a very eloquent counterposition. And he said that, notwithstanding Michael Byers' very credible exposition, it's inevitable that at some point there should be divergences in power, in perceptions, in claims and interests over the course of a long period, that is, let's say, the next century, over the course of which Canada might accrue to have 100 million people. The Arctic will melt fully, at least seasonally. It's inevitable that there should be some manifestation or expression of conflict. Now, if you were to survey these two thinkers about their thoughts post-Ukraine conflict, surprisingly, they maintain the same position. Michael Byers still was a terrific analyst and a great friend, maintains the position that the Arctic, Pax Arctica, is in the general interest. And Charles Emerson would say that we're much closer to conflict than we would think. I tend towards the latter proposition, but for reasons I'll try to suggest are slightly different. The Arctic is an interstitial space. It's not too different in that sense from the South China Sea conflict and past tensions and wars that we've had in Suez, the Panama Canal, and tensions that we even have today over the Straits of Hormuz and Strait of Malacca related to China's rise. So there would seem to be considerable prospect over the course of the next 100 years, and I would say much sooner, of some conflict between Russia and Western countries. Let me offer, before I get into some of these scenarios, let me offer 5 theses on Russia and the Arctic as I see it and know it today. One, Russia considers that it has a veto over most strategic questions related to the Arctic. That is, in the reverse, a less aggressive way of putting it, and they would put it in a less aggressive way, that not one major Arctic challenge or problem today can be solved without Russian collaboration or participation. And if you look at the map of the Arctic, I would say they're largely right. And Canada probably second there too, but the Russians, for reasons I articulate, the most credible in this proposition. Two, Russia is the most serious and capable of the Arctic countries. Serious in military capabilities, in strategic and political psychology, in its history in the Arctic, in its political will, even in its infrastructure, although it's suffering. Three, Russia plays linkage well. And the Arctic issue is, in the Russian strategic psyche, linked to other issues, although that linkage hasn't been pressed in any major way. Obviously, Canada played linkage in the last round of the Arctic Council, I think poorly in my view. The United States has played linkage, but the United States is a less deliberate linker than Russia, I think, for reasons of domestic governmental architecture, I'd say. However, Russia does, in its current form, does long-term planning poorly and has major domestic challenges, including legitimacy challenges. So there are great contradictions between the first three theses and the strategic potency that it can articulate and its internal order. 5, Russia needs Western states for economic success in the Arctic, in the Northern Sea Route, in the infrastructure, in the Stockman project, and other challenges. What about war in the Arctic? The first thing to worry about is not about war in the Arctic proper or over the Arctic. It is that under scenarios that I'll articulate soon, the Arctic would be the first thoroughfare for war that would break the great strategic good fortune that North America's had over the last century and a half. This is why I say that Russia is to the north, and war that would happen with Russia, God forbid. My mission is to convey messages that would hopefully push us in the other direction. Any war that would happen would be expressed in part through the Arctic onto North American soil, and then you would have bombardment of North American cities that we've not known in modern history, and that would change life as we know it. I think the Russians are very conscious of that, right? I don't think Canada's very conscious of it. I think the United States politically is largely oblivious to that. Warfare in respect of the Arctic or over Arctic issues or assets is less close. And that is because there's little experience of warfare in the Arctic, even on the Russian side. Infrastructure for now is poor. Military capabilities are not, although their interests in permanent bases, they're not mature. And the stakes are not yet high. So I'm talking about overlapping claims from the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. When those peak and there are big resource finds, then you can have conflict scenarios. Those are medium-term scenarios, but I think they're very serious in the absence of some of the proposals I'll make or will have made to fix the issue with Russia and the West. Over the next 50 to 100 years, but maybe earlier, very simplistically, let me say there are 3 futures that we might imagine, 3 worlds. One is conflict, either through the Arctic or over the Arctic. And as I mentioned, North American cities would for the first time be bombed, right? And the European project would die. Let me just make a quick side note on the European project, because I think Canada has a singular vocation in its Russia game to help with the sticking together of Europe and Russia in this Europe 2.0, 3.0 picture I'm painting. And that is to say that the European project, notwithstanding what's happening with Greece today, or what might happen with a possible Brexit over the next year, year and a half, is a peace project. I think we forget that in North America, that Europe at 28 countries is a major peace project. It's a heroic project of the last century, today at 28 countries, but the original mission was to box Germany in, right, through the coal and steel community. At 28 countries, it still succeeds in boxing Germany in so that it doesn't have a security dilemma. What it's failed to do because of the Cold War was to box Russia in, or to glue it institutionally into an architecture that would assure us of another peace over the next century. Right? So that if the Asians could have said that Europe has no prospect of war over at 28 countries, it would be a heroic achievement, but I think necessary to say that this century Europe has no prospect of peace at 29 or 30 countries, including Russia, however annexed Russia would be to the European project. So the second future is a cooperative future, which seems to be the view today. And I want to congratulate the United States on what seems a very coherent and persuasive agenda under its chairmanship that you've put forward under the One Arctic chairmanship. Seems very, very reasonable and proper. And I think that the Russians, if you speak to them, to my friends and colleagues there, and read the literature, are on board with that, and are actually, in many cases, much more pedantic than we are at delivering on those transactional agreements and processes and regimes. Where they would become nervous and where they don't believe today is on the strategic regime. That is to say, so the transactional cooperation, which is in everyone's interest, including the Russians, is a superficie, is a slight film, a narrow film, on a bulwark of strategic distrust. And so the long-term game, the long-term vectors are at cross purposes. So this can only last so long if the underlying game is incredible. So I would say to my American friends and Admiral Papp, it's wonderful to have you here today. Continue this work. I think that there would be great buy-in from the Russians, obviously, the Norwegians, the Danes, but the longer game is on the institutional game, and that needs to be fixed through a linkage perspective. The third future is one of disorganization and coherence, which is the South China Sea future that we have today, or present. It is one where a big power, China, has resource interests, has national interests, and has capabilities now that are at dissonance with smaller players. And without a credible institutional regime to lock it in, you have great risk of conflict. And let me just propose what the Russians call a banality. The Russians like to say these are banal remarks, that obviously our interest are in the international arena for people who are interested in global stability, to preclude the conflict future and to advance a cooperative future, although the disorganization and coherence future seems mighty possible. So just a few points to watch. Near term, and this is my primary message today. Escalation of fighting in Ukraine, or the collapse of Ukraine, or an accident or misread by the West or the East, or between Russia and Ukraine, might have consequences through the Arctic as a thoroughfare. That's very near term. This should be precluded through the points I suggested for fixing the conflict. I'll repeat those in a second. Medium term, and we don't know what the medium term is. Is the medium term 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? There will be a succession issue in Russia. At some point there will be a transition of government. And this is why there's an urgency to the Ukrainian proposition as well. It is in everybody's interest that Russia remains stable and that there is a happy succession. And let me repeat to my American friends that there is no necessary condition for the succession in being happy to be democratic and in our image, as it were. It just needs to be a stable, happy transition. Because the counter-future is hell. You know, any collapse of Russia, which is not unthinkable this century, is a hellish proposition. It is a century-long problem. And if you recall my list of the 3 conflicts, it makes the other 2 conflicts impossible to solve. So it is in the Western interest, it is in the global interest that Russia remain stable and that it have a happy succession. I'll leave it at that. Let me say, in the absence of a happy succession, there can be Arctic failure through a leadership vacuum or chaos in Russia. And because Russia has a de facto veto, as it sees it, and I think it's true, on the solution of Arctic questions, these will become insoluble through Russian incapacity. A medium to long term, and I'm agnostic on whether we can solve this. There will inevitably be overlapping claims and interests in the Arctic, new resource finds, power divergences, and the Charles Emerson thesis, in some sense, will prevail. How we manage this will be a function, obviously, of heroic diplomacy, of competence, of understanding one another better. On the understanding point, before I just get to my very closing remarks, for the young people in the room, I want to commend to you one point that stuck in my mind as I was doing a foreign policy lecture in Moscow in January, February of this year. And that is, when I say when I go chronologically to young Russians, and I cite the date 1994, the year 1994 to them, for Canadian and I think Americans too, but certainly Western Europeans, Canadians in particular, if I say 1994, what's happened in the world, they say Rwanda, right? This is even more powerful than the end of history Fukuyama thesis, which is not as interesting, I think, a point to show the psychological divergence in our comprehension of international affairs. So 1994 is Rwanda. If I say to my Russian students, even colleagues, what's 1994? Rwanda doesn't make the top 5 list. They say Chechnya. Okay? And yet, for people who grew up in universities in the 1990s, we all thought we were reading off the same script. Everyone was reading the New York Times or The Economist. Everyone was doing it in the lingua franca English, and our psychologies were melding. Not so. I think we were miseducated in this respect. And the psychology is quite different. So the Russians have a different chronology. And the lead up, and we talked about this Q&A, to the Ukrainian conflict is quite different. So what's the forward agenda for the Arctic? I'll just put on the strategic one, and we could talk about more transactional thing. I want to, again, reiterate that I think the United States program is very credible for the next 2 years of its Arctic chairmanship. I think you're on the right path. The Ukraine conflict needs to be fixed in the next 6 months. The United States needs to push for peacekeepers from neutral countries and attach 2 conditions to those peacekeepers, that is non-NATO membership, credibly so, both in Ukraine's constitution and through international guarantees, and then removal of sanctions, not related to Crimea. That will box the conflict in. To make Admiral Paps and his successors' work more credible, and for Canada to succeed as well this century, the vision, this is a bit abstract. I'd like to say that I thought of it yesterday, over dinner, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. If I think Putin was right in saying that the way to stitch back the West and East is through a Vladivostok-Birmingham institutional architecture, the same is true through the vertical manifestation, and that is some sort of architecture that takes care of the interstitial space of the Arctic, slowly but surely, and an architecture that stitches the NATO bloc, so the NAFTA bloc, all the way from Chiapas to Sochi. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time and for the invitation, and I look forward to chatting.
Yes, I'm still on. Thank you very, very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I think you've done an admirable job of covering sort of both sides of the argument and delivering a truly interesting sort of overall strategic perspective, not just over the short term. And, you know, as a former diplomat, we tend to think because of the nature of crises and solving the short-term issues, but you've given a long-term perspective, which I think was very, very, very interesting. Let me explain, though, just to fill out a bit more why I tend to be more in the Pax Arctica, camp, although with a very, very realistic sense of what is going on up there. And that's for a variety of reasons. We all know that the Arctic, is literally a gold mine of oil and gas, and that much has been, talked about that is with the ice melting, that exploitation of these resources is going to get easier, and that inevitably, there's going to be the conflict, that you described. But I think there are many reasons why, this is not going to happen over the short term, the medium term, and perhaps even much longer. Every country has its own exclusive economic zone, in the Arctic as a result of the Law of the Sea Convention, and you did not mention that. I wish you would have, in terms of, Canada's desire and everyone's desire to see us become a party to it. That, I think, is extremely important. But the point is that in these exclusive economic zones, 200 nautical miles off, virtually all the oil and gas that has been, detected so far is there. And there is no issue whatsoever as to who owns, that oil and gas. No one's going to go to war over that because I think the lines are very, very clearly demarcated. The issue, as you said, about territorial claims is the extended, continental shelf, the extended territorial boundary beyond the 200 nautical miles. And given where oil and gas prices are these days, even the Russians, as far as I can tell, everyone, the major oil companies are putting the Arctic back on the back burner, if you will. With oil at $60 a barrel and a glut of gas, that rush, that we were feeling a few years ago, seems to have diminished. And I think that's an important factor, in terms of, this view of conflict almost as inevitable and coming perhaps fairly soon. I don't think it is borne out by the realities of what is going on in world markets up there. And my good friend Rich Kozlerich, my energy expert, if I'm wrong on that, please let me know. Also, unlike Ukraine, there are vehicles, where we have methods for conflict resolution. The Law of the Sea Convention, obviously, is a very, very important aspect, to the issue of the extended territorial shelf claims. There's a process for adjudicating these things, within the Law of the Sea Convention. Russia may not like the conclusion, Denmark might not like the conclusion, but there is a diplomatic framework there that simply does not, exist already. You pointed out a trilateral commission, perhaps for Ukraine. Well, we already have the architecture, in the Arctic, which I think is very, very important. And not only that, but the 5 Arctic coastal states in the Ilulissat Declaration and elsewhere have committed themselves, to diplomatic, conclusions to these issues, to any boundary issues. I agree that these things are, at question in view of what's happened, in Ukraine. But again, there is a framework, for cooperation. Other things that I would point out, you mentioned the Northern Sea Route. I think the Russians are painfully aware, of issues with that Northern Sea Route. As I heard recently in Russia, even the Northern Sea Route, which is looked upon as a shorter way of moving cargoes, with the weather conditions being so unpredictable and with shipping being so dependent on tight schedules, it's not absolutely certain, that this is going to be a really viable network, in terms of, of future shipping. And also we've heard that the Russian icebreaker fleet is aging, and needs to be replaced. Another thing, over the short term that, is going to be a factor, I think, that one needs to consider. Other factors, you mentioned the oil and gas. Russia very, very badly is going to need, Western assistance in developing eventually those oil and gas projects, in the area. And that's going to cut, in a number of different ways. My hope, is that the Arctic, because of all these overriding concerns, the concerns of climate change, of what you call, the short-term transactional, agenda of the United States, to me that's not a 1 or 2 year agenda. That's a long-term agenda to build patterns of cooperation and work together in problems. Everyone understands, that the Arctic is the canary, in the coal mine. And if things go wrong up there, it's going to have worldwide impacts. And I think that there are certain issues today, despite Ukraine, which are broader, I think, which are going to bring us together, almost inevitably. My hope is that, and again, it's a hope, and you've given a lot of reasons why this may not be the case, but my hope is that the very obvious and self-evident reasons for cooperation in the Arctic can have a spillover effect, into other areas. I don't think, when you talked about conflict, I do think the Russian economy is in a very, very difficult place right now. I think, Crimea, and again in Russia when I was there, everyone supports, the annexation of Crimea, and there's any doubt about that. They feel it was justified. The argument is that U.S. sanctions, as a result of Crimea and eastern Ukraine are unjustified and need to be removed. But I do think that there is a different viewpoint in Russia about eastern Ukraine. I know Mr. Putin's popularity ratings are sky high, but I think that's in good part because people don't have a good sense of what is going on. And I think when you talk to the intelligentsia, when you talk to people who are well informed, what they're getting, they are very concerned about eastern Ukraine. They are concerned about getting into a mess there and expanding it in ways that will not, work out very, very well for Russia. So this may be a bit naive on my part, but my hope is that the Arctic, can prove to be an area where it's demonstrable that cooperation is a better way to go, and that this is going to have, some impact, elsewhere in the world, including Ukraine and Europe as a whole. So, as I said, I do think, though, that there are dangers there. The Ukraine has already come to the Arctic. You didn't mention, but I have to acknowledge, are the U.S. Sanctions on oil and gas equipment and development for American companies in Ukraine, in the Arctic. This is being felt very strongly, amongst Russians. They recognize that they don't have the technology, and that this, I think, is going to be one of the persuasive arguments, why cooperation should continue, in the area. But the long and short of it is is that I don't see the conflict points, over the short term, the medium term, perhaps over the longer term, that you have described. I'm much more sanguine, but also concerned, but much more sanguine that the Pax Arctica, can stay for the immediate future. So let me leave it there, and you've had some differing viewpoints here, and we can certainly go to questions right now. Hi, Caitlin. And please introduce yourself. Yeah, there'll be a microphone coming. Good to see you, Caitlin.
I'm Caitlin Antrim. I come to the Arctic from the law of the sea perspective, but also a Navy background. And when I looked at the development of the Russian Arctic, what I saw was the largest watershed on Earth flowing into the Arctic, impeded by ice. But as that opens up, as those rivers develop, and it took me a while to get through the different time frames you were using, and I was carrying ideas from one time frame and struggling to apply them to the next. But if we go to a medium term, say 30 years, where it's more accessible, where those rivers become a transport line, I think the Northern Sea Route from Russia's interest is not to help Rotterdam get to Yokohama. It's to help ports inside of the interior of Russia reach to the rest of the world and open up some trade possibilities, development possibilities. But that will mean that the Arctic becomes no longer a area of little value, not just accessible, but what do you have to risk there, but something that is something that can be threatened, which means more defense capability to protect it. And that will be Russia before it becomes northern Alaska or Canada. What's your midterm view of what the Arctic would be from the Kara Sea to the Bering Strait, which we don't see right now? And how would that influence Russia's policy in 20 to 30 years?
Well, I think thank you for the question. I think your read of the future is very much what's in the Russian literature and what's in the Russian policy debates today. Even in the late Soviet period, in the 80s, they were on top of this. Let me just preface this by saying one thing that is in the Soviet literature was even forwarded by Michael Byers in a Global Brief article when he talks about the Pax Arctica, was that the West, he didn't see the West as a core, but the Northern Sea Route claims of Russia, which under the UNCLOS regime would be as internal waters, right? They see them as
right now they fall under the ice-covered areas exclusion for control.
but they see them as internal waters, right?
But their statement of what it is, they can exert control because of the legal jurisdiction of Article 234. As long as it's mostly ice-covered, they do have a lot of control on environmental grounds.
They do. So Michael Byers' claim was that Canada and Russia could do a swap with one another. That Russia would acknowledge Canada's claim to the Northwest Passage as internal waters, and Russia would do the same.
For Canada.
Canada would do the same for the North Sea Road. So to your question, Russia very much sees it like that. I wouldn't underestimate their interest in the Yokohama-Rotterdam scenario, and all the way to South America from the Asian side. They're underdeveloped right now, and I think there are 9 ports in the Northern Sea Route, except for Murmansk. But there's a deep interest in developing what they call internal communications with Russia. So binding the territory through the Northern Sea Road. So I think you're on track there.
Question? Sir? Can we just get the microphone here? And please identify yourself. Good.
Yes, I'm Russell King. You've been talking about the Northern Sea Route, and I was looking at this paper about single